Welcome to the Neutral Podcast, where we discuss paving the way to a sustainable tomorrow. I'm Nate Helbach, your host, founder, and CEO of the Neutral Project, a sustainable real estate development company. Join us each week as we host world-renowned guests and explore dynamic landscapes of real estate development, alternative investing, sustainability, forestry, urbanism, and new cutting-edge carbon-neutral construction materials that are shaping the cities of tomorrow. Welcome back to the Neutral Podcast. Today we're joined by our friend Thomas Mende, President and CEO of Binderholz Timber, the U.S. sales division of Binderholz. Today on the show, we will be discussing forest management, mass timber manufacturing, and sustainable practices in forestry and the manufacturing of mass timber. To start, we'll have Thomas just introduce himself briefly and give a little bit of background on himself and his experience in the lumber industry and mass timber industry. And then we'll go into Binderholz and their history as a company.
Well, thanks, Nate. I appreciate you having me here on this podcast. This is my 33rd year in the lumber business. I started off working for a U.S. domestic company in the Southern Yellow Pine business, and I got involved in the export markets, the early Southern Yellow Pine times, sales to the Asian markets, and I started working in South America, importing lumber into the U.S., and finally started importing wood from Europe. Then joined, after about 17 years, joined an Austrian company, a different Austrian company than Binderholz, and headed their sales office here in the U.S., but also worked in sales there for Asia, the Middle East, Australia, and a wide variety of other countries. And then finally we started working for Binderholz in 2019 and ran the sales office here in the U.S. ever since.
Wow, that's awesome. That's a long time in the industry.
So I've seen a lot of different places, a lot of different productions of lumber, a lot of different forests in the world, and so quite a little bit of experience. I've seen a lot of construction techniques around the world and why some people may use wood and may not use wood. So it's quite a lifetime. I've traveled, I think, overall to about 87 countries now, just both for business and personal pleasure, and just hope that all that experience someday will do something good for the world.
Yeah. And has it always been in mass timber, or have you done other divisions of forestry?
So primarily just in the lumber side of things. So just, let's call it lumber. What are we talking about? It's 2x4, various other sizes that people would use in either construction or window, door, millwork operations, different flooring products, value-added products like panels. So I got involved in a lot of different things. The nice thing about the wood business is there are so many facets of it, so many different products, so many different applications. You'll never be bored in this business.
Yeah, it's very intricate, that's for sure. Well, maybe we could move to just talk a little bit about Binderholz, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about how Binderholz got started and kind of where they're at today.
Yeah, be glad to. So let's start with where it started, then we'll go where it is today. It started as a small family-owned Austrian company. The original owner of the family, the patriarch, was selling wholesaling lumber, and then finally, I think in the early 50s, was able to build its own small sawmill. We have a old picture of it in our presentations. It's really quite small, the thing to see. So, and from there, he really, the company, it's his heirs. There's now 3 brothers in the management structures, and their children are also active in the business. From there, now we are the 5th largest lumber company in the world in terms of output. We have production facilities for just the basic lumber component in the U.S., in Latvia, in Germany, in Austria, in Finland, and Scotland, and England. So in a number of different countries. But what sets us apart is really the idea that we also are very, very active in what we would call the value-added processing of wood products. That means we take it further down the stream with not just the actual lumber products that we turn into mass timber, into micro CLT, into glulam beams, edge glued panels, various other things, but also in terms of utilizing the some people in our industry will call it byproducts. I call them the non-lumber products. So this would be the sawdust and the shavings. What can we best do with those? And we're definitely a company that's very innovative. For example, we make pressed pellets out of the sawdust in one of our facilities. This is something very unique. Pallets, and I always have trouble pronouncing this. There's the word pellet with a P-E-L-L-E-T, which we also make, is for energy production or heat production. And then there's the P-A-L-L-E-T that is used as the sub base for transporting cargo. So sorry if I get confusing. It's just a problem with my pronunciation, but so it's exciting to see all these different products that the company has developed. We're now actually our most recent acquisitions in this growth spurt is actually a pallet company, and the largest one in the UK. This helps us put more value into what we call the sideboards in Europe, the outside of the log, the smaller pieces, for a higher recovery and higher yield of the log. So we all constantly look for ways to improve our efficiency, to improve our yield out of the product, to make the most out of the various components that develop when we make lumber products and things like mass timber products.
And so when Binderholz got started, did it start off with all these different products, or was it more focused on just milling lumber?
Yeah, so really, I would say that the 1954 facility was probably just making rough lumber. Probably even, in those days, lumber was often sold green, so unseasoned, undried, and it basically developed from there. So slowly but surely, the productions and the products got more and more sophisticated.
So it started off as kind of a mill company and a sawmill company at its core, and now it's grown into all the various products that we use from the sawmill.
Yeah, that's correct. And in this, like I said, there's always this search for what is the next thing that can help improve the value of the whole product chain and is the most ecological sound way of dealing with this beautiful thing we call biomass in a way. It's carbon that we're dealing with that has been absorbed from the air, and whether or not that's wood products that we might put into buildings or it's this byproduct, it's still the same. It's still biomass carbon, and what can we do the best with it?
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I guess for the podcast today, there's kind of two ways we're going to go from the sawmill. One is backwards towards the forest, where we'll start, and then the other one where we'll end up is forwards to all of the products of where things actually go after they get milled. Mass timber being one of them, but there's thousands, as Thomas has said. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the forest to start with, and just give us a little bit of background on kind of how Binderholz views forest management and also integration with the forest owners.
Yeah, it's a basic principle and basic question of what is the forest, and it depends a little bit in which part of the world you are. So there's a number of different ownership scenarios in forest. There's a different management regimes. There's different harvesting techniques that are employed. It all depends on where we are in the world. I would say that we view the forest, of course, we're not just as a resource that we use and take the forest from, but one that we have to manage in the long term. It's quite frankly one of the big misconceptions about anything that's forest industry related is that people would rob the forest of its resources and abuse it. Everybody that's in the industry has to invest large sums of money in some very inflexible operations. So these are sitting there. They're nowadays a sawmill costs you about 120, $150 million to put into place. And you don't put that somewhere where in the end the resource that you need to run your business wouldn't be there. So the industry is extremely focused on renewability and in maintaining the resource. It's in its purest form. So as you go from Europe, where the forest is primarily owned by either governments or large private landowners, but often managed by the government. So the harvesting cycles, which sometimes the marketing is managed by the government. It's quite different from, let's say, the United States, where the forest is owned by many small private landowners and, of course, some large investment funds. And it also depends on what kind of forest we're talking about. So we have to always distinguish between which exactly we're speaking of. So there's hardwoods and there's softwoods in this world. And if you go back to that, what is a hardwood? A hardwood is a not cone-bearing tree. So anything that has a cone is a softwood. Anything that doesn't have a cone is a hardwood. Whether or not the wood itself is actually soft or hard. So it can be both. So just one of our fun things about terminology to make us all confused. And so, when we look, for example, in the Bavarian forest management, which I think is the Cadillac of the world, every detail of that forest, when you travel through it, you will think, oh my God, this is a fairy tale. What a beautiful untouched forest. But it's probably the most highly managed forest, in the world. I mean, it is detailed managed. And the idea is I have to utilize the forest. If I utilize it correctly, then not only do I not harm the wildlife, I enhance the wildlife, I maximize the growth in the forest, I increase the carbon absorption. And in the end, I can also maintain an industry, whether that's a industrial industry that uses the fiber or something like a lumber industry or mass timber industry. So there's highly central planning, whereas let's say you go to the United States, it's a little bit everybody for themselves, and you have national forests that harvest and are protected. But we struggle in the U.S. with the coherent concept of how do we best manage the forests, whether those are national forests. We have a lot of arguments with environmentalists that we as an industry find quite distressing, because when we look at our national forests, we think it's something that was established so the forest would serve multiple uses. And we've come to the point where environmental organizations would like for them just not to be touched. And that leads, on the other hand, to disastrous wildfires that cause more harm and more carbon dioxide releases than anything else. So we need to learn in some parts of our world what to do properly with that forest. So again, it's a very loaded question. We probably can have 5 podcasts about just forestry and its intricacies. But if we want to go esoterically, I think the most important part is if I leave the forest alone, and I let it just do what it does, it becomes a fire hazard. That is why the National Forest Service was created, to prevent fire hazards and to allow the use and protection of the forest in continuity. So, but if I manage it correctly, then it can achieve multiple purposes at the same time. And this is I think the most important part. And why I like particularly working in the lumber industry, and why I like this mass timber industry so much, is because it will allow us to have more forests. That, I think, is the most important part. How do we protect our forests? How we prevent deforestation around the world? And how do we get the point where we have much more forests in general?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because when I was in Austria, there was so much forest. Everywhere you drive, it's like green and forest, and it looks beautiful. It's like a fairy tale, as you said. And I think one of the things I noticed is when you walk through these forests, they look so nicely managed
Yeah.
and almost like they weren't even touched by humans,
Yeah.
even though it's probably the most touched forest in the world.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I think it also relates back to mass timber and buildings, because Austria is kind of a hotbed right now for mass timber. I mean, there's so many, Binderholz is probably one of the biggest, but there's so many producers of mass timber specifically in Austria. And I think it's a testament to what Austria as a nation and government has done for its forest, of really both using it on a monetary level to allow people to go in and do proper forestation, but also to put it in the proper regulations to allow the forest to really thrive. And yeah, I think it's something that specifically in the US, we haven't done a very good job. And I think part of it is just the structure of the US, right? Because we have all these small landowners that don't coordinate at all on what they're going to forest and when they're going to cut trees down. And then part of it, I think, is because of the industry, as you said, that there's been so much kind of focused in Austria on the forest and how we need to make sure the forest in Austria keeps its thriving nature.
As you probably know, most homes in Austria are not built in, let's say, a wooden construction or a 2x4 construction method, right? So there's no, let's say, traditional history like it is in the US, the UK, Australia, and in Japan to use wood in buildings of the particularly individual homes. So in a way, it's kind of interesting to me that what mass timber is really achieving is to take some of the preconceptions of a wooden home and turning it into something that let's say the European, or it's not just European perception is of it. So just to give you an example, I grew up in a wooden home. So I was probably one of the few Germans that did so. It was a Swedish prefab company home. When I grew up, I had no relationship to the lumber business, so I had no appreciation of it. But generally speaking, a good German home is built from massive stone that does not move for the next 600 years. And, that's what everybody that's a homeowner in Europe thinks a home should look like. Well, so for them, I've done this all my life. My colleagues, they would look at tornado damage in America and say, oh my gosh, these little sticks of 2x4s, they just blow away. That's not a solid home that will last for a long time, So, and if you go to South America, for example, for many people that live in wooden homes, they're generally the poor people. So poor people that live in wooden shacks, maybe associated with the production facility or something, or their work, for them, wood is associated with not something very rich. So, and not a lifestyle that they would like to achieve. And of course, what mass timber has done is not just shift wood into a category of an office building or a high-rise building, as we mainly see here in the US, but I think mass timber, the feeling of mass timber is that this is a solid product that's massive, that will not move, that won't give away, that has strength to it, and it avoids this whole perception that it's something flimsy, that it's something that burns easily, that's something. So it gives it such a new aspect. That's, I think, is one of the most beautiful aspects. And because of that, I think we see a lot of these projects now all around the world, in Brazil, in Chile, in all these countries that would have previously not have looked at timber in that kind of fashion.
And do you think that's what's driving this, like, forest management, of having proper forest management in Austria, is the industry of wood? Or is it just that the government has said, hey, we need to make sure our forests don't catch on fire and we need to manage them so that we avoid the risk of forest fires?
Yeah, I think this is part of the uniqueness of this industry. If you want a healthy forest, you must manage it and utilize it. But if you don't have an industry that can manage and utilize it, then the forest has no value. And when something doesn't have a value, it will not be taken care of. It will not be maintained. I think this is Thomas Mende's personal philosophy on the topic of biodiversity right now. That's, you see it in these COP 28 announcements. Oh, planting forests is not the smart thing to do. We just need biodiversity. That's all nice and good, but the forest needs value. When something has value, it will be maintained and it will grow. And when something has value, people and investors are willing to invest in it. And so, big part to me of the value of the mass timber movement is really making sure that there is a market for these forest products that the forest produces, and that will enable the forest to have the value that it needs to be maintained and not just taken down for development, for solar fields, for soybean plantations, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so if you could say like there's one or two key successes to why Austria probably has the best forests in the world, do you think it's because they've been able to monetize it, or is it more of just other forces in the government wanting nice forests in their country?
I think it's a matter of saying, the forest is an integral part of my life. When I look out of the window of my factory, I see forests in front of me. I know I need to utilize it correctly. And then, of course, Austria is a place where I actually traditionally also had wood inside the home. So even if I may have had a brick wall, I may have had wood as an appearance in my house. So there's a close affinity to wood, whether or not that's on the wall or in the beams, in the ceilings, and so on. So wood has been valued, and Austrians also value the healthy nature of living in a wooden building. So of course, wood has some amazing health benefits, from blood pressure to breathing, that can really assist you in the quality of life.
That's awesome. Yeah, the last thing I wanted to touch on before we switch to the other side of the sawmill, where we get to the products, is just the sustainability kind of principles of Binderholz. I know, like, we usually typically select FSC or PEFC certified wood. Is that something that you guys have focused on a lot in regards to making sure that what you are getting is sustainable, or do you rely more on the Austrian government and the regulations in Austria to kind of manage the forest properly?
Yeah, so in all our operations, we have strict requirements to follow either PEFC or in US SFI standards. So PEFC and SFI is somewhat the American alternative to the Sustainable Forest Initiative. The two are closely cooperating. There's some debate on which one is better. Is the one better than the other? I think FSC is a commercial enterprise that has done a great job at promoting their brand name, so it's a question really what is achievable and what's manageable. Some things cannot be FSC certified. It just will never be able to, just because of the ownership requirement and the way the system is laid out. What's most important is that the product is the product, meaning the tree, is harvested sustainable, that it's replanted, that it's not destroys, that it uses its best management practice to avoid any sort of damage to wildlife. I think this is what, as mentioned to you, there's a very simple commercial reason behind it, but I think it's also a wonderful reason to maintain the forest as it is. So we're certified in all our European mills on the PEFC standard. Here in the US, it's not so easy to get it, so we're requiring our suppliers to be SFI certified, and that's how we maintain that throughout the chain of product.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. So switching from the forest side over to the mass timber and product side, I think we talked a little bit about how the logs come from the forest to the sawmill, and then they get dispersed out to the various different factories that you have. But maybe you could just walk us through a little bit more of kind of what happens after these logs get milled in your guys' sawmill. Where do they go, and what happens to a lot of the material?
Yeah, so I think it's again, it's a little bit complicated because we have so many different areas of production. But the beauty of wood is that the same tree has different qualities depending on where it grows. So to give you just an example, a lumber that is growing in Finland because of the cold nature and the climate there grows a lot slower, a lot less in per year. So the quality of the fiber is much finer. So putting that fiber, for example, into our micro CLT, which is the decorative part of our construction product segments, makes the most sense, of course. Where is appearance important? And let's say in Germany, where some of the products may be faster growing, for example, the pine grows faster than the spruce, we'll put that product into a different type of category of construction product. The long or short of it is maximizing the way the quality and the physical characteristic of the wood has its best benefit. And also, how do I don't want to necessarily transport things uselessly around the world just to have the right product there. So maximizing proximity, of course, that should be my first goal. And then if I can't get a certain quality, that's when I start grabbing it from a different location. Having that many different wood species, southern yellow pine, Norway spruce, Scots pine, Sitka spruce from in the UK and England, that's gives us a lot of options and opportunities to move the right product into the right application.
And so if we maybe narrow down to specifically the original sawmill, which is what I toured a few weeks back in Austria, what's typically going through that sawmill, and is it a lot of the material used for mass timber, or is
so it'll be a variety of things. So there's a small portion of that sawmill that will actually end up in the United States. So we'll be using some of it in some of the home center applications here in the U.S. And a large portion will end up going to the very proximate location of Jenbach, where our large glue-laminated beam and post factory is. And then other parts will go into the CLT factory in Burg Bernheim. Sorry, not in Burg Bernheim, in Austria. And then other parts, let's say lower qualities, thinner products, might end up in Italy. And then we make in that facility, for example, a steamed spruce product that makes the look of the spruce quite old, like it's an old Austrian barn product that might be sold locally in different places. So there's a wide variety of uses and destinations. And actually, I'm glad you asked this question. I've always thought it would be such a fun movie to make, to say, here's what the log cuts into, and here's all where the various products end up with, where the chips end up with, where the sawdust end up, and to just kind of follow a log really around the world in a way, to see where the fiber ends, So
we should do it.
Yeah.
We should call it like Follow the Log or something like that. And then it goes from forest all the way around the world and maybe to one of our buildings. That would be cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So as far as the mass timber, if we kind of narrow it down, I know there's a bunch of other products that I have questions on, but we could probably have a 5-hour podcast if I asked all of them based on all the products you produce. So we narrow down to just CLT and glue lam. From the mill, it goes into your factory. And then when it goes into your factory, walk us through because I think a lot of people ask me, like, how are you taking, 2x8s that we have in the US typically and turning them into these 30, 40, 60 foot long panels for our buildings? So walk us through how you go from a lamella all the way through to an actual panel.
Yeah, so I think this is a great question, and I'm glad you bring up the topic of 2x8s. In Europe, unlike in the US, we have a multitude of lumber sizes. Where of course we use metrics, and SNL has a funny sketch on metrics and imperial sizes. By the way, I just saw it yesterday. So we have at least 10 to 15 times as many different sizes available to us in the European manufacturing facility, sawmill facility, which helps us improve our yield of lumber per log by a factor of probably about 10%. So it's tremendously beneficial to be able to have that many sizes. So when people in the US say, what is our size of our 3-ply or 5-ply CLT? We have, I believe, 9 different sizes in 5-ply, just because we don't use that standard thickness of the commoditized North American market. So we can have so many different sizes in between. But and that helps us, of course, in doing one thing that's really important, which is not to have too much wood in a building when it's really not needed, which is a cost disadvantage and also a somewhat seemingly waste of the fiber in the building. Recently, there was an article about not using too much wood, and this, I think, is a valid point. I don't have to do that if I have more size flexibility. But the basic production process is quite simple. The product is dried. It's still rough in that form. It gets then smoothened by a planer mill, or some people would call it a molder process. It runs through a series of knives that spin at super high frequencies, and they basically get what we call planed, and then gives it a nice smooth surface. You apply glue. In some cases, of course, we have to step back for a second. We cut out defects that are structurally not sound. So with what we call a chop saw, we then finger joint the longer pieces back together and shorter pieces back together into longer pieces. Then we actually surface it, and then the lamination, whether or not that's a side lamination or a face lamination, occurs. And the layer process is what we use cross-laminated timber, so we produce what we call CLT, which means you have layers alternating directions, which gives the product an enhanced strength characteristic and stability. And so these panels are assembled into large panels, and then either sent to the job site or to a fabrication team, whether or not that's an internal fabrication or an external fabricator, or maybe even a fabricator here in the U.S. And they are CNC'd into the exact shape and routing and holds and whatever else might be needed to put them together. In terms of Binder, because we do have the glue laminated beam factories, and we do have such experience with construction, and particularly the large scale construction, we may attach hangers, we may attach connection points, metal connection points to the product, so that at the final step at the construction site, you may just have to put 2 connections together like a Lego set, or like I think Helmut likes to call it like an IKEA bed, so the basic principle, I just screw some parts together and now I have a finished product.
Yeah, that was one cool thing that I noticed when I was walking through the glulam line, was you guys were also fabricating all your connections. It wasn't in that facility, but it was in a different facility, which I think is really unique, because I haven't seen that with, I don't think, any other CLT manufacturer, maybe 1 or 2 other glulam factories, but it's kind of unique how you guys have everything under one roof, so to speak. I know it's different factories, but one company doing the CLT, the glulam, and then all the connection as well. So makes it seems like a lot simpler for engineers and developers to coordinate with one instead of 3 or 4 entities.
Yeah, Nate, I think mass timber is kind of interesting. When you look at just the basic panel, it seems quite simple to glue pieces of lumber together. It's not, but it seems like a very simple process. The secret sauce is really understanding the structural properties of the product, how it works in a building, and how to connect it, and then to make it so simple that on the job site, not much thinking is required, and it's a simple assemble process. Because part of the big benefits of it should be faster construction times. And if the connections aren't right, if they're not correctly designed, or if a lot of work has to occur on the job site, you lose some of this incredible benefit that mass timber can provide.
Yeah, no, for sure. Stepping back for a second, back to the kind of onset of this conversation where we started with just the lamellas and pieces of lumber. One question I had for you was, I know some factories will buy one strength grade of lumber like C24 or something else that they only use for all their panels, which I think is okay because you can then optimize your manufacturing process, it seems. But one thing that I had a question was, if we want to optimize the structure, like we don't need the same structural strength in all over the building, right? There's certain areas that get more load and there's other areas that have less load. And so is there a way for you guys to sort out different strengths of lumber, right? Because if we go back to that log, like the log is producing different lumbers with different strengths. So if we could use the whole log and like put it in chunks and then use that for different areas of the building where we need more or less structural strength, do you have the technology to sort out the strength grade of lumber in your factory?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's it goes a little bit to the question, why can European mass timber producers be competitive in the US market, right? So it's because of that knowledge and because of the ability on size and of grades to produce the exact specification that's required actually for that particular part of a building. So I think that is exactly the standard. I mean, I was in the Southern Yellow Pine business when some of the domestic producers started wanting to buy dimension lumber, and they said, okay, well, I only want this grade, and I want you to dry this lumber to a particular moisture contents, and I had to explain to them, I don't want my entire batch of lumber that I produce on that day, I don't want to have to dry everything down to that particular lumber grade to pull that small percentage that you're requiring for your production process. So either you need to pay me significantly more money, or this just doesn't work for me. And so this is part of the real challenge that maybe the domestic manufacturer faces, is there's not a lot of flexibility on sizes here in the US, and you have a certain amount of basic commodity thicknesses, and you have a set of standard established grading rules for particular grades. And if you only buy a particular grade or a particular quality, you're really limiting yourself in your own production to what you can do. So
yeah, because it just seems like you're not really being as efficient as you could with that log, so to speak, and using all of it. You're kind of requiring specific lumber pieces from the whole log.
And a lot of the when you read through the literature, a lot of the support from the U.S. government and USDA really comes from the fact that we as an industry sell them on the idea we can use the smaller logs to make mass timber, and that's correct. That is absolutely correct. We can. It just requires that production flexibility and the particular line to be able to do that. So I think it's somewhat of something that needs to be resolved on the U.S. side of production.
Yeah. The other question I had for you was on moisture content. Actually, what is the typical moisture content that you're drying to before you go through the manufacturing process, and then how are you making sure it stays at that moisture content through shipping and then also through site assembly?
Yeah, so I think the key first of all, every time you use glue and wood, the moisture content has to be below 12%. So generally speaking, it should be between 8 and 12% to get a good solid glue bond. And you do that and you achieve that by making sure that A, your product was dried correctly, B, that you have a manufacturing process that eliminates the pieces that don't have that moisture contents in your production process. And then you maintain a temperature and moisture environment in the facility where the lumber is stored and glued that is supportive of maintaining that temperature and moisture in the wood. So I think once you have a very good glue bond, the bond of glued and wood is generally stronger than just wood itself. That's what you're really trying to achieve. And then, of course, as you go through the process of moving product to the job site, whether or not that's wrapping the product or properly to keep it moisture protected, and of course you go through various exercises like that. We have come, for example, in the U.S., which has quite a, and in other parts of the world, which are have very heavy rain events. We've come to the conclusion that we will ship only moisture managed product. So we actually have partnered with, I think it's Seagull, which provides a tape which protects the wood throughout installation. And as the building is exposed to the elements, you want to make sure there's as little water damage as possible. And water damage is there's discoloration which affects things very little other than aesthetically, but in case of some species, they absorb water quite aggressively, and they can cause movements, and these movements can cause trouble at installation. So moisture management in the job site, I think, is going to be a bigger and bigger topic as this industry grows. Keeping the product protected throughout to avoid having to do work in the aftermath of construction, but also to make sure that the product performs at installation like it should until it's covered and protected. I think that's going to be a big part of the next couple of years as we see the industry grow.
Yeah, I think that education piece with the actual on-site construction team is critical. I was just in one of our trailers yesterday, actually, and the guys were taking all the timber and starting to crane it up and put it on 5th floor. And they're like, do we really have to put a tarp on this at night?
Yeah.
And we specified Siga wet guard on all of the timber, so it's on there. But I was like, yeah, we need to put the tarp on at night, because if it rains, we don't want the moisture content going up above 12%.
That's right.
And if it does, we're gonna have to let it dry out. He's like, oh, really? Can't wood just get wet?
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
Like, no, that's not how this works. We can't have wood just get wet, because then we're gonna have to wait to enclose the building so that it comes back to a 12% humidity and moisture level. He's like, oh, interesting. So I think that education piece is critical.
Yeah, it's not different from, install wood flooring. If you install wood flooring in your residential house, you make sure that the wood acclimates to the general conditions in your house before you install it, and I think that's just as important here. Not everybody can afford what the Vaxio City Hall did and train station did, which built a giant tent over the construction site and did everything completely moisture protected, which is a beautiful thing to then take the tent off and just reveal the finished product. It's kind of like a surprise present. And but of course that's very difficult. So making sure that you protect the product throughout the process, and it's really when you look at it, it's just a matter of good job site maintenance. I was just at the Under Armour job site. I think they've done a fantastic job of keeping a great clean job site and protecting the product so well, and it's beautiful to see that.
Yeah. I used to work in construction in high school, and the superintendent that I worked for always said a clean job is a happy job. So
that's right. Yeah.
We've taken that motto, and now we're using it at Neutral Project, and
awesome.
So far it's been working pretty nicely. Well, I know we got to wrap up here because we're up on time, but I really appreciate you coming on, Thomas, to talk about these things, and maybe we can have you on again in a few few months once we have a little bit more clarity of our partnership with Binderholz on our next project.
Fantastic. No, we look forward to it, and thanks for having me. It's always good to spread the gospel. In the end, I always say it doesn't matter who builds it or supplies it. I think as long as this industry is so young and has so much room to grow, the key is that everything works, and owners and the project developers are happy with it, so they will do the next project with mass timber again.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming on, and we'll talk to you soon.
Great. Thanks, Nate.
Yeah, thank you. At the Neutral Project, we're not just building structures. We're building a legacy of sustainability, helping align your investments with a sustainable future. We'd like to thank you for being part of this conversation. For more information and to stay up to date on how we're reshaping the future through environmentally conscious development, visit our social media accounts or our website at theneutralproject.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the Neutral Podcast.